evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's lecture. My name is Christine Goodfellow. I'm the Academic Program Manager here at Gresham College, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the entire team to tonight's lecture, whether you're here in the hall, which is absolutely packed, and also greetings to the people below us in the overspill, or whether you are joining us online on our live stream. A few housekeeping announcements. Fire alarm. If there's a fire alarm, it's for real. Please use one of the two exits at the end of the hall, and members of the team will help you find the meeting place. There will be a Q&A after the lecture, so if you're in the hall, you can either raise your hands and a microphone will be brought to you, or you can use the QR codes in the hall, take a photo, and enter your question online. If you're online, there will be a QR code at the bottom right corner of your screen, and you can also submit questions throughout the lecture, and we try to keep the questions evenly balanced between questions from the hall and questions online. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you from the bottom of my heart for your generous donations during our Christmas fundraising appeal. With your help, we raised over £56,000, and it will help us enormously to continue our work here at Gresham College. So thank you very, very much for your generous donations. I'd like to introduce Dr. Sophie Ooosterwijk, who will give tonight's lecture on life, death, and judgment in the art and times of Jheronimus Bosch. She's the Vice President of the Church Monument Society and was for many years editor of its journal, Church Monuments. Sophie was born in Gouda in the Netherlands and is a recognized specialist in Early Netherlandish and Dutch art. After studying English at Leiden and medieval studies at York, she obtained 2 doctorates, greedy, in art history from the University of Leicester and English literature in Leiden. She previously taught art history at the Universities of Leicester, Manchester, and St Andrews. Since her return to the Netherlands, Sophie has been working as a freelance researcher and guest lecturer at the University of Cambridge and the Art Society, amongst many other organizations. She's published widely, especially on death, the dance macabre, and commemorative art, and her latest book, a co-edited volume entitled Writing, Dancing, and Performing Death Across Late Medieval Europe, was published just last month. So please welcome Dr. Sophie Ooosterwijk.
Jheronimus Bosch is a bit like Marmite. You either love him or hate him. Now, I'm not going to try and change your mind, but what I will do tonight is try to explain a bit about his work, and that'll be a bit, because there are still many, many questions. And I'll start gently, because you associate him with scenes of hell, but in the Christmas season, that seems a bit mean to start with. We'll get there. So instead, I'm starting with this one. A work that we can actually date fairly securely, because it was painted between 1491 and 1498, and that has to do with the fact that the couple you see, and I'll show them to you in detail in a moment, were actually married in that period. It was the second wife of the husband, and death made an end date to the painting. So around 1495, it's the Adoration of the Magi, or also known as the Epiphany Triptych, one of many paintings by Bosch or attributed to him in the Prado in Madrid, and I'll explain why in a moment. Now, what you see on the screen is a continuous landscape that continues across the 3 panels, because it is a triptych. The wings can actually close, and I'm not going to show you the outer shutters. It is all about this scene. It's not about death yet, nor about judgment, and yet you will see a few elements there that will come back in other works by him. Now, first about the patrons, but because that already raises an important point. They were from Antwerp. Peter Schijve and his second wife, Agnese de Gramme, were a wealthy couple, middle class. And if you consider that Antwerp was 3 times the size in population of 's-Hertogenbosch, it's interesting, they came all the way to 's-Hertogenbosch to commission this triptych. And if you look at their portraits, one has to say that the husband has individual features, but the wife looks very bland indeed. The artist may never have met her. But that is an important point, because in Antwerp there were perfectly good portrait artists. Portraiture is not Bosch's forte, and yet they come to him exactly because of what he is famous for. Now, hell, but that isn't visible in this painting. But there is something else that is important, because Bosch is also, and he's often underrated in that respect, a pioneer in landscape painting. He is superb. He's a fantastic draftsman. I haven't got time to show you his drawings, but if you look at the two details from the side panels, the wings, there's already so much depth there. He knows how to use aerial perspective, that is, using grey tones to make the far distance look really far away. But there are also, and truly it is the case with Bosch, the devil is in the detail. Because if you look at the left-hand panel over there, you'll see that the peasants are happily dancing in the fields, and that may look quite merry, but anything that looks jolly in Bosch's work is bad for you. And in the other panel, you see that a woman is being chased by a wolf, and a poor traveler, he's actually a pilgrim, is actually being probably killed by a wolf. So death is there as well, merriment and death. Now, the central panel, I could tell you a lot about that, but I'm afraid not in this lecture. But already, on the one hand, it's pretty straightforward. There's the adoration of the Magi, but there is, and I'm sure you can see him, that fourth figure in the doorway, a very pale, half-naked figure who is sometimes interpreted as King Herod, but more often as the Antichrist. That is one of the weird things in Bosch's work. And also rather curious is that face peering in through the hole in the wall, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And the owl, and that is another element that will come back over and over again. I hope you can just about see him on the screen, that little blot there underneath the roof in the middle one of the three images. Now, what about that face? Whenever you see a particularly individual face in Bosch's work, especially peering in through something, there's often that question of, is it a self-portrait? But that is where I'm going to give you a bit of background information, because Bosch, unfortunately, is to a large extent unknown to us. We know he was born somewhere around 1450, and that is by calculating back from the first moment he occurs in the records and from the period you usually needed to finish your apprenticeship. He's born into a family of artists. They originally come from Aachen, that is his grandfather. They moved to Nijmegen first. His father and uncle are also painters. So are his brothers, and then the next generation, there's at least one painter and one sculptor. But we can't identify any of their work, and yet there was a family workshop. So, and we don't know what he looked like. This drawing was always believed to be a self-portrait, but we now know it dates from around 1550, and Bosch was long dead by that time, and we can only hope that it was based on a lost original. But that's an awful lot of supposition. Now, just to give you the map in case you don't know, Aachen is at the bottom, the corner there, so that is where the family come from. They are technically German. Then, as I said, they moved to Nijmegen, and they settle, and that is where Bosch is born, in 's-Hertogenbosch. But unlike the rest of his family, who all call themselves van Aachen, which means of Aachen, or from Aachen, he calls himself Bosch. And that sets him apart from the rest of the family, and also notice, by the way, the distance between Antwerp and 's-Hertogenbosch. It's a long way to go for a triptych. Now, you already know enough about Bosch, otherwise you probably wouldn't be here. He is highly individual. His imagery has puzzled art historians for centuries. In fact, in the next century after his death, people were already puzzled by what he intended to convey. And there was a lot of emphasis then, too, on, yes, he's a great painter, symbolism, the detail, often misunderstood, the landscape settings I've already mentioned, but also, was he a heretic? Was he a member of a secret cult that indulged in orgies? There's absolutely no evidence for that. Quite the opposite. He was a member of a local, very prestigious brotherhood, a lay brotherhood, which still exists to this day. And the fact that Philip II of Spain collected his work, admittedly, he was born long after Bosch died, so it is retrospective admiration. But Philip II had one of the paintings in his bedroom, and he genuinely did think it was orthodox. And Bosch himself, well, we know, born around 1450, he married a local girl, probably had no children. We don't know whether he had an individual workshop or whether he worked in the family workshop. All of these things make it very difficult as well to authenticate work by Bosch. But when it comes to devils and hell scenes, you have to understand something very important. Towards the year 1500, there was a great fear that the world would end. And this Christian eschatology is not just typical of Bosch. I'm just going to give you one example. There are many others I could cite. But Albrecht Dürer designed his woodcuts for the Apocalypse series, which was published in 1498. There were 15 woodcuts, and the Four Horsemen are quite famous. Cartoonists use them a lot as well. But that is about the end of time, that fear. And that fear is a double one, because it's not just the end of time, but the end of individual life, because after that will follow judgment. And another theme, and that is definitely one of my specialities, is the dance of death, a theme that dates back to probably the end of the 14th century, but really becomes popular and widespread across Europe in the course of the 15th century. You get woodcut editions from the middle of the 15th century onwards, and those editions would have spread also to the Low Countries. This is one from 1486, originally published the year before by Guillaume Marchand in Paris. And what is the Dance of Death? It's basically an encounter between the living, everyone from society, high and low, old and young. You see here the Pope, the Emperor, but also the Franciscan and the infant in his cradle. And the idea is, and very often irony is used, that everyone must dance, even the Pope and even the baby who can't even walk. The texts are there, and this was meant, this theme was meant to warn people about the suddenness of death. Death can strike at any time. You have to be prepared. Now, I've already mentioned one thing, well, estate satire, because estate satire, there is humor as well, and I'm showing you here one page, actually two separate woodcuts from a German edition earlier than the French edition. And you see female characters, and I can't help but think that the way the serpents are greeting the women opposite has a strong element of, well, shall I say, Mae West about it. There is undoubtedly Schadenfreude. You know, if I must die, it's a good thing to know that the Emperor and the Pope must as well, but also sexual innuendo at times. And what about it then? Sudden death, not just the end of time around 1500, but sudden death. You had to be prepared, because if you died with sin on your conscience and you weren't shriven before you died, it could bode badly for you. And for this, there was another book that was popular, at least amongst those who could read, although the illustrations themselves are quite telling, and that was the Ars Moriendi, the art of dying. And that showed in separate chapters and woodcuts how to die a good death, or in this case, on your screen, a bad death, because the saints have been relegated to the background, and instead the devils surround the dying man and remind him of all the wealth he has been enjoying, his horse, the drinks in the cellar, his fancy house, and of course that is a very bad way to die. And the detail in the corner opposite is a work that is sometimes attributed to Bosch, a detail I'll show you the whole thing in a moment. So it's about judgment. And very briefly, because we are in London, I want to show you this wonderful work by Bosch. And by the way, I'm using the Dutch spelling, Jheronimus. The crowning with thorns, or Christ mocked, is actually crucial to his work. It's a devotional work. And although Christ appears to look out quite calmly at us, and notice, by the way, how the crown of thorns acts as a halo as well, he is surrounded by four baddies, four evil characters of different ages. They may, some people have said, represent the different ages or the different humours. The man with the red headcloth, for example, in the bottom left-hand corner, was originally spitting at Christ, and he may represent water. But the thing is that Christ looks out at us, the viewer, and he asks you to choose sides. He is looking rather, well, without any hint of passion there, calmly, but that's not the right word. He will ultimately be the impartial judge. He's not going to rule in your favor. He will judge you for what you're worth. And here, he's already forcing you to judge yourself. Do you side with Christ, or do you side with evil? And evil is being presented here as four very unattractive characters. Now, that's quite important, because that idea of Christ judging you in this life already for what you're doing now is crucial to Bosch. And we see that, and I showed you a detail of that deathbed scene a moment ago. Now here we have to be careful, because whether it's by Bosch, as the Prado would have us believe, or not, as the research project believes, it is certainly of the period and the vocabulary of Bosch. It's the tabletop of the 7 deadly sins and 4 last things. Now, we call it a tabletop. It could have been used as the top of the trestle table, but there's no evidence that ever happened. But that is why some of the scenes are upside down. And what you see in the center is Christ, the risen Christ standing in a sarcophagus, emphasizing his side wound and the wound in his hand, and emphasizing that he died for our sins. Bosch's way of thinking and that of his contemporaries was very much in line with Catholic doctrine. And the words in Latin underneath the image are cave, cave, Dominus videt. Beware, beware, the Lord sees everything. And that, of course, is what we see all around. And it reminds us again of that panel in the National Gallery. Now, I'm not going to show you all 7 of the 7 deadly sins. Again, I would need more time, but some of them will suffice, because in the past, and you can think of Giotto in the Arena Chapel, the 7 deadly sins were allegories, usually female figures, same as with the virtues. Allegories tend to be female and very abstract. But in this painting, whether by Bosch or not, the 7 deadly sins are very much everyday scenes. Gluttony is, well, unmistakably a scene where people are getting grossly overweight because they indulge themselves too much. And I love the heavenward look of the woman who brings in yet another piece of fowl. Pride is actually vanity, a woman admiring herself in a mirror. It doesn't strike you as a very deadly sin. We all do it on a daily basis, but it's a sin. Wrath or anger is, well, almost Friday night at the pub. Outside an inn, 2 characters are, well, trying to have a fight. A woman is trying to stop them. And sloth, well, it's that time of year. Who hasn't been guilty of that? Dozing away in front of the fire. But the opposite of that is a life of contemplation personified by the nun behind the man in his comfy seat with a cushion behind his back. And all of these things, and there's also lust and greed and envy, are 7 deadly sins. And the rest 4 last things show where they'll get you. Now, again, I have to say, the first one, the deathbed scene, was briefly on the screen before, and that is very much in line with the Ars Moriendi, the devil and the angel waiting to take the soul to hell or to heaven. The heaven scene of the Last Judgment, again, I'm going to skip. but the one in the corner is hell. And that is a really helpful scene, because what you also see is each of the punishments carries the label of the actual sin that we saw in that main circle. And so in the same Latin terms, we see a woman and a man being threatened in the tender parts by animals, a toad in her case, and a devil is holding up a convex mirror. They represent superbia, pride or vanity. I like the vat in which people guilty of greed are being boiled alive in molten coins. Well, boiled was, I say people, but of course we're talking about souls. All these sins are actually souls, and they're being punished in a very physical way. Then we've got envy, a man spread-eagled or soul spread-eagled being stuck in, oh, that's actually anger. Envy is actually the scene in the background in that small detail in the bottom corner. A soul being torn to pieces by devilish dogs. I like the ones I actually picked out. Sloth, a soul being beaten on the buttocks in a smithy, and gluttony is a very fat man in a tent being served creepy crawlies, toads and so on. So all the punishments you're guilty of in this life are going to come back to haunt you in the hereafter. That is the message. Now, again, remember that, because some of these themes and some of these punishments will come back in his more famous works. But first, I'm going to show you a few of his other works. This one is actually part of a dismantled, disassembled triptych. It is known as Death and the Miser in Washington, and what we see is pretty straightforward. The devils are there, but you expect that with Bosch, but death is coming in through the doorway. A man is sitting up in bed. The man in green in the foreground may be his alter ego, the man in his lifetime when he was already obsessed with death, and then when he is dying, an angel is imploring him, before it is too late, to turn his thoughts and his eyes towards the crucified Christ that's hanging in the window. But of course, the man is mesmerized by the spectre of death, and he's reaching out, most likely to try and get hold of another bag of money held out by a devil. Some people like to think that he's actually relinquishing it, but this panel gives very little hope. It seems very likely that this man will die an evil death, tempted by devils towards greed. Now, I mentioned that this panel, now a standalone panel in Washington, was originally part of a triptych. And this was a wing that has been sawn asunder because the other side was actually part of this. The peddler, or the wayfarer, or everyman, or sometimes called, but incorrectly we now feel, the prodigal son. Everyman is actually not a bad term, because although he's technically a peddler, he's got a backpack with goods on his back, he is a poor soul. He's mankind making his way through an evil world. And although it's now been joined to make a tondo, originally this was part of a larger couple of panels, and they've been joined together, but this was originally the intention. Now, what we see is, as I said, man in threadbare clothes, different shoes, turning his back on an inn, and an inn often doubled as a brothel. It's a house of ill repute. You can see rather shady characters in the doorway and the window, and the fact there's a man urinating against the wall by the corner is, again, not a very positive sign. The poor man has a dog snarling at him. He's going to have to make his way through the gate where a bull awaits him. In other words, it is an evil and dangerous world. And that is also, and Bosch clearly likes his birds, symbolized by the owl in the tree above, because that is preying on a blue tit, an innocent day bird, and we tend to associate the owl with wisdom, but in Bosch, it is a bird of the night and a bird of ill omen. The night is an evil time, and in Bosch, the owl is always an evil symbol. Now, the peddler comes back in another work by Bosch, again in the Prado, because these are the exterior panels of a triptych. This is in its closed state. It's the Haywain triptych, but I want to show you as a continuation this particular scene, because it's another variation on that same peddler, the Everyman character. And that little detail I showed you in the Epiphany triptych comes back here as well. On one side of the peddler, you see the peasants who are neglecting their flock. They're dancing and making music with bagpipes in the fields, but as a juxtaposition rather than a contrast, because both of them are in their own way evil. Self-indulgence is evil, but then so is the scene of robbing another traveler and possibly killing him. We see him tied to a tree. And again, there is the wary look on the face of the peddler. There's a snarling dog again, and there's bones and birds by his side. It is an evil world. Bosch's view of this world doesn't seem to be a very cheerful one. And then when we open it, well, it looks a lot more colourful, but that is not necessarily a good thing, because this is what gives the triptych its name, the Haywain triptych. And the Haywain is an allegory for all things that ultimately are worthless, but seem worth fighting over in this life. It's about, to a large extent, materialism. Now, you have to read this panel from left to right. That's usually the case, this triptych, usually the case with these triptychs. You read them from left to right. The first two panels show a continuous landscape, but then everything changes. So I'm going to start with the first one, and that is actually the scene of paradise, but paradise in which there's already trouble in the sky. Because in the sky we see God throned, and he is casting out the fallen angels. And this has to do with choices. Just as Adam and Eve had a choice as well, whether or not to take the apple, Lucifer too had a choice whether or not to rebel against God. He chose, and it carried consequences, the fall of the rebel angels. And so we see the creation of Eve in the distance, then actually the temptation and fall, and then the expulsion in the foreground, with Adam still arguing and Eve looking rather crestfallen. So when you continue the landscape into the central panel, it's worth remembering that there is a connection. So it's about choices and consequences. And here we've got, in a way, that same theme we saw on the panel here in London and in the tabletop, because in the sky, Christ is showing his wounds, reminding people on the ground, so to speak, of his suffering on behalf of mankind. But of course, no one pays any attention. Once again, we've got an angel who's kneeling and looking up, but the lovers on top of the Haywain are simply making music, being helped by a rather musical devil playing on his snout. And then when we go to the lower level, people are fighting to get their hands on the hay. They're being crushed under the wheels of the hay cart. They're killing each other. It's interesting that they are also from all estates. I mentioned estates satire earlier on. And behind, I hope you can still see, behind the Haywain ride rather than walk several people of higher standing, including the emperor and the Pope. In the foreground, we see nuns gathering hay for a very fat monk or abbot. We see a dentist, but especially the killing. There's also a fool in blue in the foreground who is playing his bagpipes and looking back behind him. And notice also the signature of Jheronimus Bosch, although that's not necessarily proof. And what everyone is ignoring is that the Haywain is being carried or pulled along by devils, just as in that scene in the woodcut of the Ars Moriendi. It's the devils who tempt you, and it's up to you whether to resist temptation or whether to give in. And of course, these people are all giving in, and the consequences are visible in that third panel. And that's how it usually ends with Bosch's triptychs, a scene of hell. And so here we have it in all its glory. There's fires in the background, which some people have associated with a mega fire that struck Bosch's hometown in 1463 when he was in his early teens, possibly 12, 13, and that really got very close to his house because we know that the beams, the house still exists, the beams in the attic were replaced after the fire, shortly after. So that may have been a traumatic experience for him personally, but as I said earlier on, the whole idea of Christian eschatology and the end of time was already rife amongst his contemporaries in any case. And the scene of hell, well, apart from the fires, we see different punishment. Very typically, it's either the world topsy-turvy, or it is being punished for very individual sins. So we see a devilish hunter who's bringing along the, well, one would say a slain body, but of course they're all souls, and another soul is being hunted by devilish dogs. Another one has got a toad on his genitalia. They're being carried and pushed along towards the gates of hell, that building that is still being expanded because there will always be more sinners, and so you always have to make more room for yet more souls. So the punishment of sinners in hell is very vividly depicted, and there's no denying that Bosch must have had a very strong imagination to depict them as vividly as this. But then, of course, we come to his most famous painting, The Garden of Earthly Delights. And that is, in many ways, an enigma, but some of the details I've already shown and explained to you here just now may help to explain this painting too. This is what you see when the altarpiece is closed. We call this grisaille, grey tones, monochrome. It almost looks like a kind of divine experiment, because what you see is a very flat earth that seems to be floating in some kind of crystal ball. You can see the reflection of the crystal. That's not a fault of the photography. That's how Bosch imagines it. And this represents the third day of creation, where God is busy creating the earth, separating the land and the water. And the words of God and the figure of God are there in the corner as well. So God is overlooking this experiment, and he says the famous words, ipse dixit et facta sunt, and he said, and so it was done. Everything is created according to his words. But already, when you look at that detail, it's a very strange world, because there are excretions, and you can't call them rock formations. It's one of those things of, is it animal, vegetable, or mineral? It's certainly not the world as we know it, and already it seems distinctly dubious, let's put it that way. But when we open it, and that is often the case with these triptychs, you've got grisaille on the outside, and then when it opens up, you get double the side, and then you get the full technicolor. And that is when this triptych became very popular in the 1960s and 70s, because it seemed to really epitomize everything about free sex and drugs and rock and roll and everything jolly. But as I said before, whenever anything looks jolly and merry in Bosch's work, you can bet it's bad. So, again, we've got a landscape that continues across the first two panels, and then everything changes. It becomes dark and forbidding. So once again, we start with paradise, and for a change, there's not a fall of the rebel angels. That does occur in another work I'm not showing you here. But here we've got a scene of paradise where God is creating Eve from Adam's rib, and I'll show you a detail in a moment. But again, what I mentioned earlier is Bosch is a fantastic landscape painter. The landscape is indeed fantastic, but it is quite convincing in terms of depth, and also in his observation of animals. Okay, the giraffe may not be totally accurate, but he would never have seen one. It's recognizable, because of course this is also the period of discoveries of Columbus has already gone to Americas, or the Americas, and books are being published in print about the fabulous animals, but also the actual animals in Africa. So we see an elephant alongside unicorns. There's also lions. And what you will also notice is, the swarms of birds. And birds seem to have a very specific meaning for Bosch, especially in this work. And also the fact that death is already there, because above the head of the giraffe, you can see that a lion has killed an antelope and is devouring it. And though this is paradise, death is already there. And that is there in many ways. As I said, in the center or in the foreground, we've got God creating Eve. Adam looks as if Christmas has come early. He's got a delighted smile on his face. Eve is kneeling down very modestly, but behind her are rabbits, and they are there for a reason, because after all, the message is to go forth and multiply. But then again, here too, we have death. We see that figure of a bird in one corner eating or busy devouring a frog, and there's that cat-like creature that has caught a rat or a mouse, and so death is already there. And evil is already there, because I mentioned the owl earlier on, and almost exactly in the center is the owl, in that very strange pink fountain-like, because there's a lot in this panel that looks distinctly odd, including the rock formations and this fountain surrounded by gemstones. But in that hole in the center of the pink fountain, and it's almost exactly in the middle of the whole panel, is the owl looking on. And as I mentioned earlier, he is a bird of ill omen. But then, at the same time, it looks attractive in color, and as I said with the Dance of Death as well, Bosch is typical of his time in painting a message and yet using humor, because that kind of duck-billed, half fish, half human creature is floating in the water reading a book. And I can't help it, but anyone who paints that can't be totally serious. There is a tongue-in-cheek element about his work as well, which is in some ways rather cheering. Now, we move from this paradise to the central panel, even though the landscape continues across the two. And here people have had different opinions, and they still do. As I said, in the 1960s and 70s, this was a big hit in posters and record sleeves, and it seemed to sum up everything about free sex and fun. It's not paradise. It's not the world before the flood. It's either an allegory, just like the Haywain, or it's a false paradise, and they are not mutually exclusive. So it's a false paradise. Everything you see here that looks jolly is bound to be bad. The idea of why it might be paradise has to do with fruit. In past years, when it was in the royal collection in Spain, it was referred to by one archivist as the strawberry painting, because there's lots of fruit. And again, that is just like the Haywain, highly symbolic. The fruit is gigantic. Strawberries, they would have had flavor, but they would certainly have been very small in those days. And of course, it's a very fragile fruit, very short-lived. It will soon rot away, and that's exactly it. The fact that it may taste sweet and smell sweet, but it will soon go sour on you, quite literally. So the strawberries are there, the apples are there, the fruit everywhere, and people are indulging themselves. And as I've said earlier, self-indulgence is a sin. It will get you to hell. And so everyone is naked, everyone is young and handsome, and everyone is having fun. It's almost, indeed, it is like a bit like the opium eaters. They are gorging themselves on fruit, being helped as well, as I'll show you in a moment, by the birds, totally obsessed by indulging the senses, and that is sinful. And the birds are there to encourage them, and they are beautifully observed. I mentioned the owl already. It's difficult to assign specific symbolism to individual birds, but what you can say is that Bosch knew how to observe birds because they're all highly individual and recognizable. You've got the kingfisher and the hoopoe and a duck, and they are huge. The people are small by comparison, and they are being led by the birds. The funny thing is, it's like the world topsy-turvy. Instead of going out to feed the birds go out to feed the humans, and that is not how it should be. It is dangerous, and there you can see it, this whole multitude of people waiting to be fed berries by one of the birds. But of course, you will also see the owls. Here's two of them, two naked figures being swallowed up by a flower on top of which an owl is squatting, and another figure in the water, foolishly grinning as he embraces an owl without realizing that that is evil. And it's not just about gluttony, because, as I said, the strawberries and the apples are allegorically intended. They are an allegory for sin and self-indulgence. But it's also sexual self-indulgence. In the center, there is a fountain, sometimes called the Fountain of Youth, totally populated by young, luscious young women, and there are male figures racing around, riding a variety of animals, some of which may well symbolize the 7 deadly sins, like the goat for obvious reasons, and the pig, but it's also about as many different creatures as possible. And they're racing around, following their natural instincts, you might say, but that is not how a rational human being ought to engage. We don't see Christ in the sky. We don't have to. His presence is implied. We know that no one would pay him any attention. There's only one couple of figures, a man who seems to have a moment of contrition or being caught in the act. The woman may be resisting, but everyone else is just happily indulging in sex and fruit and, well, all the rest of it. And of course, you know where that is going to end, because inevitably, as we saw at the start and here again, the triptych ends with that last wing. And you also have to see it as quite symbolical. Not only do you read these triptychs from left to right, but of course, from their point of view, the sinners would go to Christ's left-hand side. Hell is always on the left-hand side. It may look like the right side for us, but you have to see it from their perspective and from Christ, who will send sinners to his left and the blessed to his right. So if you see it that way, you know that hell has to be on that side. And there it is. Now, a lot of it is highly imaginative, but some of it does bring back memories of the works I've been already showing you. So we've got punishments for gambling, for example. Notice that the hand that has been stuck to that shield with a knife holds a die still. Another gambler, there are playing cards on the floor, has got a knife stuck through his hand. That is the hand with which you play the cards or roll the dice. There's a woman with a die on her head. Notice there's once again a hellish hunt. There is a hare that is actually the hunter and a human soul that's being attacked by devilish dogs. Above that scene is a woman who's being forced to look at herself in a convex mirror that is suspended from the bottom of a green devil, and she's got toads and a toad crawling up her chest and a devil embracing her. There's more fighting going on in the other corner, but notice also there is a reference to greed in the fact that one soul is actually defecating coins, but also being made to vomit coins. That is a reference to greed. A pig with a nun's veil is forcing a human soul to sign a document, a sealed document. Again, what that refers to, but clearly clerical and church abuses. And then there's music, and it's all music of hell. There was the idea of heavenly music, which is harmonious, but in the dance of death, death also often plays very loud music, drums and bagpipes. Bagpipes are not usually considered as very elevated courtly music. And here we see it, the blue bird-headed devil is actually defecating, swallowing souls and defecating them again. But the musical scene is indeed torture. One soul is being locked up in that blue drum. You can just see his face peering out. Another, with musical notes on his bottom, is being squashed by that string instrument on the other side, whereas another soul has been strung up in the strings of that harp. One figure is not just only tied to a flute, but also has one stuck up his behind. Music is being used as a form of torture. And then we get the most famous element again, an element that cartoonists have used quite a lot, the famous tree man. The tree man whose body is like that of an egg, his hat is made up of a millstone and a bagpipe, and figures are walking around there. His tree legs are stuck in boats which themselves are stuck in the ice, and his hollow egg-like body serves as a tavern. As I've said before, a tavern was often a house of ill repute and could double up as a brothel. The female figure with the horned headdress, may actually be the madam of a brothel. But of course, it will be a hellish brothel where everything is different from how you would enjoy it in this life. And then, of course, there is that enigmatic face of the tree man himself, right in the center, or almost right in the center, looking over his shoulder. Now, I've said before, we had that face peering in through a hole in the wall in the Epiphany triptych, and it has often been suggested that that may be Bosch's self-portrait. It'd be lovely if that were true, but we can't prove it. As I said, that drawing we have in Arras, always thought to be a self-portrait, actually postdates Bosch by several decades. There is a statue in the marketplace in his hometown, but again, it is based on a print that is based on this drawing, and we really don't know. And we also know very little about Bosch. As I said, he came from a family of artists. He married a local girl. They don't appear to have had any children. She outlives him. She actually has a house of her own on the market square in which they will live, but we don't know whether he practiced his own workshop or whether he continued with the family workshop, which is why it is so difficult to talk about work by Bosch or by the workshop. We just don't know. And we don't know what kind of figure he was, other than highly respected, member of the local guild. He received commissions from the couple in Antwerp I showed you at the beginning, but also the Duke of Burgundy. And what kind of man was he? Well, I can't help but think that someone who paints like that, the big strawberries, the floating figure with the book in the water, must have had a sense of humor. And he must have known exactly some of the sins, at least. He did rather well financially, so he must have known greed. Being a Brabander, he is most likely to have known gluttony as well. He must have known human foibles. And so the idea that the tree man is a self-portrait is an attractive one. I don't think Bosch was necessarily the man who would go around saying, we're all going to hell. But yet he painted that, perhaps because that is what people wanted. And why not make a good living that way? But I want to finish off with these 4 panels, all the same size, badly damaged. They're to be found in Venice. We don't even know in what order they were meant to be displayed or whether there was once another panel combined with them. They're usually defined, and again, that's very modern interpretation, as the fall of the damned, hell, earthly paradise, and then the one everyone loves, the ascent into heaven, or the tunnel of light, which is a very modern idea, because the tunnel of light is what people have often described in near-death experiences. It's also what physiologically happens when you die and your eyesight disappears, and apparently the last thing you see is light disappearing like a tunnel. The tunnel of light is perhaps for Bosch as well the sign of hope, and maybe Bosch, with his fear of the end of time, is very modern in our time as well, when so many things are threatening us. but maybe for Bosch and for us, there is light at the end of the tunnel still. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this fascinating lecture. We've got time for questions, so if you want to ask a question in the hall, my colleague Sarah is there with a microphone and bring the microphone, or if you want to use the QR codes either online or here in the hall, please scan them and submit your questions. But I think we've got one right behind you, Sarah. Do you want to start at the back?
Thank you so much for this. I'm not sure if this is on.
Hi. I can get another one. Hang on. Can I get another microphone?
One is that, especially if Bosch was already well known in his lifetime, almost no other painters outside his circle sort of copied or continued his particularly imaginative depictions of hell. Were there sort of theological or artistic reasons against doing so? I mean, why did that sort of style not carry on with others?
Oh, it did. It did. That's often a misnomer, because the idea that Bosch was, a one-off. He would have had a workshop, as I said, part of the family workshop perhaps, but if he had his own workshop, he would have had pupils. And you only have to look at the work of Peter Bruegel, who was born after Bosch's death, and he too has got his very dark paintings. You can think of The Triumph of Death, Mad Mag perhaps, less so, but his prints too. He depicts the 7 deadly sins and the 7 virtues, which aren't as interesting. But the 7 deadly sins, that print series, also owes a lot to Bosch, and he's not alone. There are other artists too. In Bosch's lifetime, I mentioned Albrecht Dürer, but also there were other artists who depicted the contrast between heaven and hell. And certainly after 1500, when the world clearly hadn't come to an end, there is yet a revival around the middle of the next century, so around 1550, which is the time of Peter Bruegel. And again, you've got other artists, one of Bruegel's sons also depicted hell scenes. So it does carry on. But it is a bit of an acquired taste. It's not for everyone.
We've got another mic, so if anyone has a question in the hall. Yeah, okay. Thank you. No, you don't have to do anything, just use it. No. Hello?
This one.
Second to last lecture.
The devil is at work with the sound.
Swapperoo, yeah, there we go. Quick one. The title, The Garden of Earthly Delights, is that a modern title, or was that the title that was originally given, or what?
Yes, it is a modern title. As I mentioned, titles were usually descriptive, or rather people normally, and that's also true for later periods, giving titles to works, artists giving titles, a fairly recent development. So if you look at Vermeer and Rembrandt, they did not send paintings into the world calling it The Laughing Cavalier, or that's actually Hals, or Girl at the Virginals. So they're descriptive titles. And of course, the moment you call it The Garden of Earthly Delights, it's a bit of a dangerous one, because Bosch and his contemporaries would have known it. If it's earthly delights, they're bad for you. But people have tended to focus on its delights, so that's good, that's positive. But no, they're not. So they're all modern titles. The Haywain, that's an easy one. But as I said before as well, when it comes to the peddler, for a while people thought it was the prodigal son, because it seemed to fit the biblical story quite well. We've gone away from that idea. He's more likely to be a representative of mankind. But you can find works described as the wayfarer, or the peddler, or everyman. So they're modern titles, and they change according to museums and art historians changing their minds.
There's a question here online. Are you aware of any modern artists being inspired by Jheronimus Bosch?
Oh yes, Dali for one, Salvador Dali, definitely. One detail in the Garden of Earthly Delights, in the Paradise scene, Dali actually uses one of his optical illusions. The rock formation becomes a face that he then uses. But of course, the surrealists loved Bosch because it seemed to sum up everything they liked. I use the word surreal between quotation marks usually when it gets to Bosch, because he would not have used that term himself, obviously. But yes, for different reasons, probably less so the Christian thinking behind it, but the surrealists loved Bosch, and modern artists still do. And the Spanish have adopted him. They call him El Bosco and tend to think he's Spanish to begin with, rather than Netherlandish, which of course I object to.
Any other questions in the hall? Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for the wonderful lecture. It's so insightful and fascinating, really. I was wondering, you said that there's not enough information, or we don't know much about his life. I was wondering if there's anything that we know about his relationship with the government and Catholic Church, because in one of the, I think it was Haywain Triptych, that depicted the Pope and the Emperor as the sinner. So I was wondering how the government and the church would have looked at that.
It's a good question, and you're absolutely right. But that is already part of a longer tradition, because if you look at medieval imagery, then monks and nuns in the margins of medieval manuscripts often get up to all kinds of things. And of course, you also have the papal schism, and that was quite an important thing. It undermined the authority of the Pope when you had two popes, one in Avignon, one in Rome, and then to resolve that situation, they appointed a third pope, or elected the third pope, and then you had three popes, and the other two didn't actually step down. So that is resolved in 1415, thereabouts, at the Council of Constance. But before there was 20 years gone, by the end of the 1420s, the cardinals learned their lesson. If they didn't like the Pope, they elected another Pope. So the papacy has actually suffered quite a lot, and you can already see, the beginnings of the Reformation. People are beginning to question the whole idea of indulgences, for example, letters that will get you more quickly through purgatory. And criticism of the church or of functionaries or of abuses within the church had been there for a long time. You can think of literature as well, Piers Plowman, Chaucer. So Bosch is part of a long tradition, and he was not alone in depicting popes and cardinals and monks with tonsures in hell. The idea again is that no one is safe, and that was a very strong tradition. Death will strike everyone, and anyone can end up in hell. So if it can happen to the Pope, just imagine how you as an ordinary mortal must behave, how well you must do to avoid that fate.
Yeah, we've got one more question here.
Thank you. Thank you for your really fascinating lecture. I was very interested by your comments about the birds, and I wondered whether, because you got through a huge amount, and just to give you an opportunity in a way to say why you think he's so interested in birds, and what was the kind of cultural significance of birds at the time?
The one bird we can easily explain, I've done that already, is the owl. But when you look at Bosch's drawings, he does draw landscapes as well, and the owl comes back quite a lot in his drawings. And he clearly is observing animals. For the more exotic animals like the elephant and the giraffe, he relies on prints and books on natural history that are being published. But I can only imagine he loved birds, and by throwing it around, the whole topsy-turvy idea of birds are small things that flutter about, and instead you make them huge, and it's the humans in the Garden of Earthly Delights who are dependent on the birds, or make themselves dependent on them. It's to do with topsy-turviness. I personally can't. I haven't yet found a solution that convinces me personally. There have been attempts to explain some of Bosch through proverbs. That has been done. Problem with proverbs is that unless they're being written down, it's oral history, and proverbs are simply no longer used and get forgotten. So there are certain elements in his work that come back where we think maybe there was a proverb underlying this particular image. But there's also something like individual preferences and individual interests, and maybe, for all we know, he was a keen ornithologist and went out in weekends to study birds. Certainly the way he depicts them, he's clearly studied them carefully because they're so recognizable, and maybe that was a bit of self-indulgence as well, of using birds for his own private ends in his work.
I think that's all the time we have. Thank you very much. I'd like to all be aware of the next lecture in this Death and Society series, which will be Death Investigations, What Do Coroners Do, by Sir Peter Thornton, on the 5th of February. And for this term, we've got one more next Wednesday on a Tudor Christmas with mince pies and mulled wine and everything. So that's where our autumn term will come to a close, so I hope to see some of you then. But thank you very much, Professor Ooosterwijk, for this fascinating lecture.